Omars were brought or came to America under a refugee program. It gave them special ability to enter the U.S. and to have their pathway to citizenship. And that was presuming that they were not serving in the military or the genocidal military of the country which they came from. It turns out that that was actually the case. This was something that was buried by the so-called fact-checking industry and the mainstream media. They called it misinformation. They called it an anti-Muslim smear. But the reality is that Ilhan Omar's father was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime, is a Marxist-Leninist regime responsible for genocide of a neighboring tribe, and he was a senior official in that very regime.
And yet he denied association with that government and claimed he was trying to escape it?
He cast himself as a so-called teacher trainer. This was the term that kept coming up. I've never heard this term before, teacher trainer. Sometimes it was educator, and it was denied by him. It was a idea that was spread by her as well. But most of the heavy lifting was done by Snopes, the, again, so-called fact-checking website. They relied on some very obscure Minnesotan outlet whose own reporter that made this claim was later sued for misreporting, and that claim became the basis for this entire notion that what they had said was misinformation, that in fact he was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime and not a so-called teacher trainer as she and the rest of the media claimed. The irony of this entire story is that the evidence that he was actually a colonel in the regime came from the Somali American community itself. So Mr. Omar died in 2020 of complications from COVID. And right after he died, there were a lot of obituaries in local Somali language and English language outlets in Minnesota claiming and celebrating the fact that he was a colonel in the regime. They were not ashamed of it. They thought this was something to be proud of. And they wrote these obituaries detailing his service in the Barre regime as a colonel, detailing how he climbed the ranks within the military, detailing his service in various wars under the Barre regime. And eventually this became so overwhelming. It was reported by a number of outlets in the US as well as in Africa reporting the same information. So what the New York Times and CNN and CBC and the rest of them got wrong, small outlets in the United States who did not have the same agenda were reporting actually truthfully. And that local outlet was written, that story for that local outlet was written by a reporter who was almost sycophantic in his praise and his effusive adoration for Ilhan Omar as this like rising left-wing figure in politics and young and diverse and DEI and all this stuff. And that same reporter was the one who was later sued for a number of misrepresentations. That outlet had to settle that lawsuit. It was the same guy who made these claims. Snopes never mentioned that fact. They didn't investigate that at all, even though it was publicly available information. They just had their claim, calling this misinformation, attaching it to so-called Islamophobia, when in reality it was true. And then what happened is you had this cascade from Snopes. You had PolitiFact making the same claim based on the Snopes claim, based on that one article by this local City Pages Minnesotan outlet. Then Reuters makes the claim, then the New York Times makes the claim, then the networks make the claim. And by that point, if you dare to contradict it, if you dare to even look into it, you get cast as being Islamophobic, as somehow having this misinformation agenda against Muslim people in America. And this is something that clearly warrants further investigation, because if this all bears out and we have the evidence, we now know that this is actually the case. And the other twist here is that I don't think this is the end of the story regarding her father. I still think there's more out there. I'm working on it right now. I'm hunting down the facts, but I don't think it ends with the so-called his just being a colonel. I think there was much more going on. What we need right now is a proper investigation by the government. This cannot be trusted in the hands of the mainstream media, because they're not going to do the job. Still today, they're going to run cover for Ilhan Omar. So we really need a DOJ investigation to understand exactly what happened, what was put on that immigration application, and what the reality was, and whether that broke the law. I would imagine so, and I would imagine that these documents are readily available to anyone who wants to look into this. But again, this was kind of all it was all just kind of cast under this cloud of Islamophobia. So nobody wanted to touch it. It became toxic and radioactive. And at the time, we remember Ilhan Omar herself was serving on the House Intelligence Committee, and she was thrown off the committee. And that's how bad things got for her right around this period. And it was a lot about her making anti-Semitic remarks, but it was also tied to some of this stuff going on in the background. And again, we don't fully know the truth yet, and I think there's much more to come. But all this stuff, especially being kicked off of that committee, it really signals that there is something serious going on here. It was a dictatorship, as they generally are, the Marxist-Leninists, and it was extremely repressive, extremely poor, impoverished. But one thing that some other researchers have noted is that in Ilhan Omar's own description of her life there, she talks about living in a compound. She talks about having a car, which was extremely rare at that time. This, for her personally, was actually a life of privilege and power, which obviously accords with the notion that her father was a senior military official in the regime. That's how people within those regimes are treated. They're not treated like everybody else. So she wouldn't have borne the brunt of what the rest of the people living under that repressive rule would have had to endure day to day. She lived a good life, and it's probably only because Siad Barre lost power that they had to flee, because they no longer had the cushy lifestyle. They didn't have the political protection, and it was time to go. They positioned this as them being under threat from this general upheaval, but it was the upheaval caused by the man her father was serving. It was right up until around 1991 that the Barre regime was in power, and it was the civil war that brought it down. And like in any other case, if you are part of the regime that has just fallen, your number one priority is to get yourself and your family out the country. And the other thing to keep in mind is that not anyone could just leave the country. You would have to have significant means, political connections, and a lot of know-how to be able to pull something like that off. This is an extremely poor country. This is, as you said at the beginning of this, one of the poorest countries in the world. There's not infrastructure. There's not embassies that you can just go and apply for a visa or refugee status to another country. And that would have taken significant political influence to pull off, which they clearly had. So again, we see Ilhan Omar, though she positions herself as a victim of this, in reality, she was part of the very regime that was coordinating and organizing all this. And it's exactly that allowed her to flee to the United States to seek shelter and create a new life, and to become a congresswoman within no generations, within the same generation that she arrived in the United States. The truth is that Ilhan Omar is an extremely skilled operator. She's very good at casting a narrative that she wants. She probably learned that from her father, is my guess. And she's always been able to manipulate the media and to bring out the Islamophobia card. And though today that's kind of worn out a little bit, we're talking about a time frame of around 2016, 2017, 2018, when it was very much in vogue, and any kind of mention of that kind of terminology would just shut down any kind of discussion. And she knew that. She used that to her advantage in an extremely savvy way, and in a way that is very skilled. Again, you know, this is very programmatic. I don't think this is her just kind of speaking off the cuff. I think this is all part of a extended, entrenched propaganda campaign that's designed to do exactly this, to invert the values of the United States and to destabilize. And it's not a coincidence. She said this on Al Jazeera, which is a network that is effectively owned and controlled by the Qatari government. The recent director, this equivalent of a CEO, is a member of the royal family of Qatar, who are aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is the Muslim Brotherhood who is mostly responsible for pushing exactly these messages. They've aligned with the Marxists because it suits their agenda. It's extremely effective. It's extremely toxic. For some reason, academia eats it up and just gloms onto it. And this is where we are today. It's very hard to fight this stuff because they're extremely savvy. They don't see truth as an anchor or as a consideration in any regard. It's all about advancing the narrative, in this case, a Muslim Brotherhood narrative, and it's working. This is the worst part about it, is that it's effective. You know, I think the point you're making is a great point, and I think that the real underlying point is that there has to be a pushback. there has to be a pushback against the narrative, against the messaging, against the underlying strategic aim. And it has to start with actually exposing what's going on, because we have for too long turned a blind eye under the sort of guise of tolerance and even free speech. And that's great. Free speech is essential. And I know we all support it, but that doesn't mean that we don't investigate, we don't expose, and we don't push back and assert what we believe to be the fundamental values of the United States of America, which is that this is a democracy for all people. It's a democracy founded with a specific ethos that was about advancing the values of Christian belief and Judeo-Christian belief, and that's okay.
Yes.
At the end of the day, that's okay. I say that as a Jewish person who grew up in the United States, and I respect that, and I respect the foundation that the country was built on. And I think to not acknowledge that and to not respect it makes the country weak to the point that the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're talking about a few thousand people, are able to infiltrate our most important institutions and to completely subvert them, which is exactly what they've done. It's because we lost sight of these fundamental values. We gave them up too easily and too quickly because we're afraid of being called all these names that actually had no meaning. I do know that Snopes had to update their reporting, their article, on the basis of my reporting. They acknowledged that he was a colonel and that that was not actually misinformation. They did. I don't believe that they said that they had previously told audiences that it was misinformation, but they now say that he was indeed a colonel in the regime, and but that none of the other media outlets who reported this went back and corrected their stories. I reached out to Snopes and PolitiFact and a bunch of other organizations for that particular story. I got no response from any of them. So if you got better luck than me, that'd be amazing. He was a citizen of Somalia, and he was deported, I think, last December, if I get that right. But that's exactly right. That's something that there is precedent, and this is part of an effort to sort of go after the perpetrators of whatever they commit, whatever kinds of crimes they committed as part of that regime, to sort of claw them back. There is a sort of counter movement in the United States of Somali people who are victims of this regime, who are trying to seek justice for their family members, for their friends who were killed by the Siad Barre regime, or who are displaced, or whatever happened to them. So there is actually another side to this, and that's another part of the media's failing on this story, is to not talk to those people, because they're also Black Somalis. They're out there. They just haven't been platformed in the way that Ilhan Omar and her entire group or crew of political operatives in Minnesota have been. And he was found liable in a civil suit for the torture of a Somali herder, and that was why they were able to deport him, because they specifically were able to tie him to an individual crime that was considered to be to invalidate his refugee status in the United States. My guess, again, is that with her father, the story goes much deeper than the surface level that what we've been able to establish so far. The problem with the reporting right now is that we're just trying to undo the damage that Snopes, PolitiFact, and the mainstream media have done. This is part of like a propaganda stew where you don't know the ingredients. You got to like separate them out just to establish the basic facts, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of work. But I think now we're on a pathway where we can actually figure out what he really did. As far as I understand it, it was because they were able to tie him to the specific crime. As I think there was a ICE press release that reads that Ali personally engaged in torture while a lieutenant colonel in the Somali National Army, and he ordered soldiers under his command to detain, torture, and assist in extrajudicial killing. So it was really that they were able to find the specific crimes that he committed, and the fact that he did it in the context of serving as a colonel in the Somali army. From the reporting I've done so far, after this initial story, my sense is that the chances are very good that people know who he was, they remember him, and people in the United States as well who have specific information about his activities. This is not speculation. This is stuff that I'm working on right now. So I think this is something we're going to see unfold, and the story is going to move forward. And I think we also still need to completely resolve the question of her brother and their marriage. It's still kind of this gray area, and there's an answer out there. My sense is that the answer is that she did actually marry her brother in order to get him papers to the United States. As far as I know, that brother's no longer at the US. I believe he's in the UK somewhere. It's unclear. But that actually does need to be resolved one way or the other, and it requires serious investigation, both by the government and by the media. And a lot of this gets really confusing with the different naming conventions that they have in Somalia, which get sort of mixed up, and they use different kind of conventions in different contexts. The other thing is that she has very purposely maintained a lot of ambiguity as to who her siblings are and even the number of siblings she actually has. So this is kind of a number that fluctuates when she speaks about it differently. And it's really not clear what the definitive number of siblings she has. And again, this is potentially part of some effort to obfuscate on this question, because if this were actually proven out, it would end her political career at the very least. So one of the biggest reports I've done on the Wikipedia stuff involves a group of around 40. There's really about 10 or 12 who are leaders of the group, pro-Hamas. They're editors. They're sort of removing mentions of Hamas crimes, including terror attacks. They're doing the same for Hezbollah. They're sort of whitewashing Hezbollah. They're acting on behalf of the Iranian regime. They're removing human rights abuses listed on Wikipedia. So this is stuff that's done to advance the own interests of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. One of these editors removed any mention of Hamas's genocidal 1988 charter from dozens of Wikipedia articles. This is not something you do just because you're a hobbyist or you're an enthusiast for Hamas. Like, you're doing this in alignment with whether or not that person is directly paid for them or somehow in their employ. It's unknown, but this is aligned exactly with their own objectives and how they try to appear and present themselves to not just the American public, to the world. So the damage is immense because Wikipedia is not a walled garden. What is on the site doesn't stay on the site. It gets pulled into ChatGPT, into Gemini, into every frontier AI model. It basically populates all of Google on a topic search. It is what feeds into Alexa, into Siri, and what becomes ground truth for most of us without us actually ever knowing that. This is one of the problems with Wikipedia. One of the very big problems is that these editors can sort of sling these accusations, or they can warp a topic area like American politics, or like I reported previously for Pirate Wires, which is they systematically establish this narrative that Trump is a fascist. They did it by relying on outright Marxist sources that consider themselves to be Marxists, but they do it under the protection of anonymity provided by the site. So the site doesn't know who they are. We don't know who they are. They're having this outsized influence on American politics itself. And this is all happening under the sort of aegis of Wikipedia and Wikimedia Foundation, which owns the site, being granted tax-exempt status by the United States government. And the other thing that's going on here, which we do have more insight into, is that I would say a significant portion of the money that Wikimedia Foundation receives from donation, we're talking about $185 million in income a year. A lot of that money gets passed through to radical left-wing NGOs. It functions almost like a cutout. The other piece here is that there's significant ties between Wikimedia Foundation and Hillary Clinton, and also with George Soros, who, again, I reported, did a whole story on this. A lot of Soros's most senior people were put into or came to Wikimedia Foundation in 2017, which is right at the time Wikimedia Foundation redefined the mission of Wikipedia from just being an online encyclopedia into becoming a social justice movement powered by DEI.
The background of Ilhan Omar is really fascinating, and of course, like so much in her background, completely unexplored. The media has no interest in delving into where she comes from, who her influences were, what her family members did. And I think the most amazing thing about her story is actually that she holds these views. She describes herself as an intersectional feminist. She's obsessed with identity politics. She sort of personifies the perfect multiculturalist leftist milieu, and she could have picked up those views as easily in the enclave in which she grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as in the Somalia of her birth. And I think it really bears noting, incidentally, that no one has really ever talked about her family influences, even though she talks about quite frequently the influence of her father and grandfather on her own political course, and they were both members of the government. Her father called a teacher's teacher within the Somali regime, and her grandfather has been able to director of marine transport there. And that regime was a Marxist Islamist dictatorship. And that is not Ben Weingarten talking. That's actually how the New York Times described it, and how Siad Barre, the dictator who ruled Somalia, under which her family prospered, how he himself described it. She came over with her father and a sister as well in the early 90s, originally to Virginia, and then they resettled in the Minneapolis area, where there is a very large enclave with tens of thousands of Somali refugees who are resettled there. And again, it's quite interesting. No one has really done the digging, delved into what her father was doing there, but the reality is, as a teacher, and as many other teachers that she has cited, formed her kind of family background there and influenced her. A teacher in a Marxist Islamist regime, Soviet-backed, was themselves inculcated in the ruling Communist Party ideology of the Soviet Union. Again, it was a Marxist Islamist dictatorship itself. And the fact that no one is even curious about what influence her family members had on her is quite interesting, as is the fact that, by her own admission, she was privileged to use her own party's parlance in Somalia, rather, before she went to a refugee camp in Kenya. She lived in a compound. There were beggars outside. Her family would feed those beggars. She talks about a house filled with books and the like. Just this wonderful paradise-like experience in, again, a Marxist Islamist dictatorship. She comes to the U.S., and again, what's amazing about her district is that her district, which consisted largely, and this is as a state representative, her district, which consisted largely of Somali refugees, also consisted as well of 2 college campuses. And it was actually those college students who pushed her over the top in helping her topple a 44-year incumbent in Minnesota State House to ascend to be a state representative, and then shortly thereafter a member of the U.S. House as well. And I mentioned Obama before, and the parallel is, interestingly, that she was also a community organizer. She talked about the fact that her parents told her to organize for what she wanted to achieve in the U.S., her brand of justice, which of course is antithetical to the justice that you and I believe in. That she sort of personifies the unholy alliance between the left and Islamists. And I had Andy McCarthy write the foreword to this book. He wrote the book, The Grand Jihad, where he talked about sort of how these two sides reconcile their seemingly antithetical views on social issues and a whole number of other issues. And I think really the simplest answer here is that they are able to set aside their differences because it is Judeo-Christian Western civilization that stands in the way of both of their paths to conquest for power. Obviously, the worldview of the progressives flouts completely the ideals, principles, values, institutions of our founding. And of course, we know that Islamic supremacist ideology is inherently expansionist, totalitarian, cannot brook any sort of dissent. So in this regard, they're both totalitarian belief systems, and the stumbling block to those totalitarian belief systems is best represented in America. And so if you believe that America is inherently evil, it's a stumbling block to your system, as Ilhan Omar has argued, and she basically has called us, in far harsher terms, deplorable, irredeemable, ignorant, and the like, then naturally justice demands that you overturn that system. And so what I argue in the book, and I go back and look at the historical roots of both the Jew hatred among socialists and on the left, and the Jew hatred that has predominated in the Islamic world for centuries, they have come together really in the last 50 plus years, and it was in the Soviet Union and the Middle East, a very deeply intertwined alliance there against the West, which they would call, the capitalist, imperialist, oppressor West. And Ilhan Omar is sort of the modern instantiation of that belief system, value, and ultimately their goal of toppling us. It's really important to note that she was named the co-chair of his campaign in Minnesota, which is a pivotal state in 2020. So this isn't some bit player. This is actually a very substantial player in the Democratic Party today. And also, with respect to Bernie Sanders labeling himself now embracing his Jewish identity, where before he completely ignored it, essentially, he has basically described his Jewish identity as leftism. And that speaks for itself, stands for itself. And I would argue that that is not actually what the religion stands for. In any event, in terms of the whole anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism thing, not only does Ilhan Omar surround herself with people who attack Jews qua Jews, not just the Jewish state as the collective Jew. What I argue is that in reality, what that Jew hatred comes down to is a hatred of Jews and the Jewish state as representative of and a bulwark for Judeo-Christian Western civilization. And so the Jew hatred itself goes beyond just Jews to all of us, everyone in America who believes in our founding values, traditions, and principles. And I go in great detail in the book to show that she actually checks off every single box of Natan Sharansky's a 3D definition of what anti-Semitism is, what the State Department definition of anti-Semitism is, what the broadly recognized international definition of anti-Semitism is. But again, it's Jew hatred as a stand-in for hatred of us, hatred of all Americans.
That's all for today. Thank you. If you want global news to keep you up to date on any new developments, please subscribe our channel and forward our content with your friends on social media and email. Thank you very much for keep supporting me. Stay safe. Be blessed. Namaste.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.